Good morning to you all. I have really looked forward to this weekend to be with you. I've told the story way more than I probably should, but I met John as a student at St. Andrews. I was studying under a friend of John Barr's, and this is a true story. John apparently showed up in St. Andrews and introduced himself to the student body as Rowan Williams, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. And it's a true story. And it was a small enough community that I remember distinctly being in my own study carrel and hearing some of the students rumble about Rowan Williams has made a kind of drop-in visit today, and everyone was excited. But it was John, actually. So anyway, I'm very glad to be with you. It's good to see former students. Known a little bit about your parish. Happened to meet Chase's dad and at Beeson at some point. So I'm excited to be here. I'm going to pray in a second, but before I do that, I'm happy for this to be a little bit of a kind of repartee back and forth. I'm going to yak and talk, but if there's something that you want to stop at some point and Chase, feel free to do that. I think the plan is we'll go to about 10:45 this morning for the first session. Take a little break and then come back, and then I think there's going to be a Q&A at the end. But you know, this is a small enough group, and I kind of like the interaction. So if there's something that you want to chase or pursue, feel free to do that. So let's pray. Our Father, we are so grateful that in your mercies you've brought us together on this Saturday morning. I'm amazed and so grateful to see a group of people willing to come out and give of their time because they're hungry for your word. Lord, I'm in desperate need of your help this morning. I pray for your Spirit to be present among us. I pray, Lord, that even in the brooding character of a book like Ecclesiastes, you would press us through that, O Lord, to see the beauty and the glory of your Son. The great Ecclesiast came in to redeem the world of disorder that we live in. And Lord, I pray that you will bless us, Lord, and strengthen us in grace. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so here's how we're kind of going to go. Session one, I'm entitling this "The Brooding Clouds." All right, so this will be the hard part, I think, of our morning together. And then session two, I'm calling it the bright silver lining of the book of Ecclesiastes. So we'll start off in session one, dealing with the brooding clouds, and then move to session two, where I think Ecclesiastes ultimately takes us in terms of a consciousness of hope. Let me say something a little bit about the Ecclesiastes and where it's located in the Bible. And before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about why the book has become meaningful to me. I'm in my mid-40s. And I think if you'd have asked me in my late 20s, early 30s, beginning of my vocation, my career, I would have probably looked a little bit askew or a little bit cynical toward the so-called midlife crisis. I'd heard about such things, but I'm like that. I wouldn't have taken it all that seriously. And then I turned 40. And I don't know what it is, and I've read enough about it. Arthur Brooks has a new book out, I think it's called From Strength to Strength. I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about something happening to them at midlife that causes them to reflect on the character of what it means to be and what God's called them to be. I don't think it's without accident that when Dante begins the Divine Comedy, he describes himself as being in middle age, finding himself in a dark wood. So there's something about middle age that causes us to think about ultimate things that happened to me. And here's, I think, again, I'm not imposing, this is my story. I know there's some academics in here. This is how it kind of worked in my world. I went to seminary and got excited about the life of the mind and the faith. Went off and did a PhD, motivated by fear and energy, got a dissertation written. Then you got to get a job, right? This is how this all works. So now you're in your late 20s, you get a job. I was 29 when I started teaching Nathan. Nathan doesn't know this. I was only 2 weeks ahead in Hebrew when I was teaching him. I'm like, they would ask these, you know, they would ask, I can say it now, but then they would ask these questions, you know, about defining points of Hebrew grammar, and I would say, oh, you've got enough on your plate right now. We'll get to that later. Truth is, like, I wasn't quite there yet myself. I had to relearn this. But you get a job, and then, you know, in the academic world, you know, the creme de la creme is getting tenure, and you have to work for that. At least in my world, so you got to publish a few things, and you get excited about your writing, and the point being, everything was the plane taking off of the runway of life. You know, you go and you do your graduate studies, and then you get the job, and then you work toward tenure, and then you work toward promotion, and then I'll never forget when I finally got tenure where I teach, my dean looked at me in his office, Timothy George, and I'm, you know, 40 years old at this point, 38, something like that, and he says, well, that's all I've got to offer you. This is it. Like, you know, bless you and continue to do your work, but that's it. Like, you're done. And I remember thinking through the dynamic of the plane of vocation leveling off at 30,000 feet. Everything was ascent, but in my 40s, the plane began to level out, and it brought a crisis. And I was really surprised by it. I would not have expected that would have happened. Why am I doing? I mean, the basic things. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Do I enjoy what I'm doing? That noonday demon that the medieval mystics would talk about, acedia, sloth, grabbing heart, ennui, something that the French would talk about, listlessness, wondering what it's all about. Those things were real. And I will tell you, in God's kindness, I feel like sort of pressing through this, but Ecclesiastes was really huge for me in the middle of all of this. It was a book that I really feel was the kindness that the Lord gave to me to kind of sit with this book. And I will tell you, I'm going to offer a reading strategy about my reading on Ecclesiastes. I don't in any way claim a comprehensive view of the book. Ecclesiastes is open, one of the more controversial books probably in the Bible. It's open to lots of different entry points. I'm going to give you Gignilliat today, but, read other things. But for me, it's been a book that's been life-giving. And I will tell you, there are some very dark clouds in this book. There's no way to attenuate that. There's no way to try to get around it. That's why I'm so glad you're here. I was joking with John earlier, like, okay, Ecclesiastes on a Saturday morning or cooking shows. I'm like, I think I'll take cooking shows, actually. So here you are, and I'll just warn you, there are some dark clouds, and we will talk about that head on. But as time has gone on for me with this book, I do see Ecclesiastes as driven by this effervescent and glowing silver lining that sort of outlines sort of the dark clouds of this book. And so that's where we'll go. Now let me say something about where the book of Ecclesiastes is located. Our English Bibles, I'm going to get a little academic-y here with you for a second. Our English Bibles are ordered in a particular way, and no publisher is going to touch it. And they probably shouldn't. So when you look at your Bibles, Old Testament, which is God's preferred testament, just joking, but the Old Testament, it's ordered in a very clear way, and it makes a lot of sense. We have the books of the law. If I had a board up here, I'd scribble this up. We have the Torah, Genesis to Deuteronomy. Then you move through a collection of historical books, right? So we begin with Joshua. And you basically follow a nice plot line from the day of the judges, right, the conquest of the land, all the way until the exilic period. So you're moving from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, that weird book Esther, right? And you get this kind of nice historical book setting that moves you all the way even into the Persian period with Esther. Then you flip a page and you're in Job. That's a jolt, right? Job's a book we're talking about. And Job's a book actually worth reading in association with Ecclesiastes. We might get to that. We might not. We'll see. But you turn to what we call wisdom and poetic books in our English Bibles. So you have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. I just lectured on Song of Solomon yesterday to a group of men. That will arouse the imagination, right? It's quite a book. So you have these poetic books here. And then we move to the prophets, beginning with Isaiah and then ending in the book of the 12, primarily with the book Malachi. And it's a nice way in which our Bibles are ordered. I would never want to take that from you. It's rich. Malachi opens up beautifully to Matthew. It works. It works. The Hebrew Bible, though, if you were kind of wandering the halls of Barnes & Noble, the aisles, and you were to go to the Jewish Publication Society section and find a Hebrew Bible, it's called Tanakh, right? Now, many of you are familiar with this, and the Tanakh stands for law, prophets, and writings. It's a different ordering. It's not ordered according to a 4-part structure like our Bibles are. It's ordered according to a 3-part structure. Law and prophets and writings. In fact, there's some things that I feel very strongly about, but I don't know if I'd go to the guillotine over. Like Trinity, the head would have to come off for that one. Single subject Christology, the head's going to have to go off on that one too. My view on Luke 24, I could change my mind, all right? But when Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples on the road to Emmaus, which is without doubt one of my favorite stories in all the Bible, I tell my students at Beeson, if there is Friday night, movie night in heaven, and I'm hoping there is, where you actually get to see the scenes of the Bible in real, no Charlton Heston, the real Moses, like I'm there every Friday night. And I'll especially go to the Emmaus night because it's just, there's layers of comedy in this. It's meant to be not Jerry Seinfeld funny, but it's funny. I mean, there's humor here. Jesus is asking these 2 disciples, hey, what's going on? And they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem that doesn't know what happened about Jesus? And Jesus says, well, pray tell what's going on. I mean, that's, again, it's not Seinfeld, but that's funny, right? There's layers here. And then Jesus is with his disciples in the upper room. And there's so much to talk about with this, and I won't chase it. But he's with them in the upper room, and he explains to them the significance of his own person and work in conversation with the scriptures of Israel. Now, I'm among sacramental people this morning, so I love this. Jesus teaches them the word, and then he breaks bread in front of them, and those 2 things together allow them to see Jesus. That is very, very powerful. Word and sacrament coming together, allowing them to see who Jesus is. And then they say that remarkable turn of phrase, did not our hearts burn within us when he taught to us the Holy Scriptures? That is so rich. And then the last scene, Jesus comes back, and what does he do for his final time with his disciples in Luke? Another Bible study. It's remarkable. So here's Jesus, and I'll just kind of plant the seed. From a very real standpoint, the author of the Scriptures of Israel, think of that, with his people, describing himself and his significance in terms of the language of the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And I'm pretty persuaded that when Jesus says the Psalms there, he's not just speaking of the Psalms, but as the Psalms as the kind of titular head of that whole 3rd part of the Old Testament called the writings. So the law, the prophets, and the writings, that tripartite Hebrew canon, which probably some fuzziness at the edges of what books were in and out at that point in time, but the law, the prophets, and the writings, Jesus is saying to them, all of that testifies to me. It witnesses to me. Ecclesiastes is a book that's located in the Hebrew canon in the writings. And the writings, I think, are where, if I had to go and spend a lot of time on a desert island, I'd want the writings with me. Because what the writings, in effect, are, here are the books that are in the writings. Psalms, Job, Proverbs, the 5 little books called the Megillot, which is Ruth, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Daniel. Those are the books that are in the writings. And those books in the writings assume the authority of the law and the prophets. In other words, the law and the prophets are forming what we might call the fundamental grammar, the theological framework of all of the Old Testament. In fact, Jesus can often refer to the scriptures of Israel in a shorthand way as the law and the prophets. So the writings, this third part, books that don't fit in the law and the prophets, like Psalms and Ecclesiastes, they assume the authority of the law and the prophets. We're going to do this in Sunday school tomorrow. That's a little plug. We're going to talk about Psalms 1 and 2 tomorrow in Sunday school. Do you call it Sunday school? Adult education hour. Whatever it is. And we're going to talk about the way in which Psalms 1 and 2 introduce all of the Psalter, but link us back to the law and the prophets as well. There's a bridge thing going on there. But the point is, the Psalms and the writings assume the authority of the law and the prophets, and here's why I find them so enriching. They help us think about what life on the ground looks like. What does it look like to be? What does it look like to live in the complexity of real human life in light of the authority of God's Word and the law and the prophets? And I love this about the faith, and this is where we're going to go this morning. What I love about the Christian faith is if you are looking for escapist literature, there are religions on offer. I think a lot of Christians really wish they were Buddhists. I would love to escape at some point in time the problems of the body. The Bible's not going to let you go there. The Bible is going to force you to look into the mirror of your humanity, come to terms with it, recognize the reality and the burden of it, and seek to live and lean into it in light of the authority of what God has promised to you in the law and the prophets and the entirety of Scripture. So this is one of the reasons why Ecclesiastes is such a gift. Ecclesiastes is hard, and it's not a walk in the park, it's not beach reading, but it's honest, and it's careful, and it's kind, in letting you not escape the reality of your human finitude, but to come to terms with it. This is all throat clearing, by the way. A couple more things, and then we're going to get to it. The tradition, the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition link Solomon to 3 books in the Bible. And I like these 3 books, right? So, for example, Rabbi Akiva would argue that or suggest that Solomon wrote Song of Songs when he was in his youth, which kind of makes sense, right? I caught one of my teenage boys one time reading Song of Solomon, and I'm like, that's fine. Yeah, have at it. It's a good book. He wrote Proverbs in his middle age, thinking about what it looks like to live life well. And then Solomon writes Ecclesiastes from the standpoint of older age. Now, lots of critical questions sort of related to that. But that tradition of reading Solomon as leaving us these books that reflect something about the temporal frame of our lives, I think can be helpful. You'll find this interesting. The Christian tradition actually placed Song of Solomon as the last book that Solomon wrote because it anticipates the heavenly life. That's interesting, but we'll leave that to the side. So Ecclesiastes comes to us as a book that's written from a man in his old age who's passing on wisdom to the younger generation if they're willing to hear it. I mean, in effect, the Ecclesiast, the preacher, Kohelet, is the technical term in Hebrew, is kind of putting his arm around those that are younger than he is and saying, if you have the will and the affection to listen to what I'm saying, I have some wisdom to pass on to you because I've seen some things under the sun. I've lived some life, and I would like to pass on to you what some of these things are. So the larger question about Ecclesiastes, I think, is what is this book about? It's open to a range of options, all of which I don't think are compatible with each other. Is Ecclesiastes the despair literature of the Bible? Did Solomon in his old age become something akin to, Franz Kafka or Albert Camus, a brooding consciousness about the meaninglessness of it all? Some think so. Does this book reflect the absurdity of human existence, leaving readers adrift in terms of life's joys and its ultimate purposes? Do Solomon and Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, shake hands in agreement over this book and say, yes, indeed, Herr Nietzsche. Nietzsche says this in The Birth of Tragedy. The nauseous character of humanity's existence includes only pain and absurdity, and Kohelet and Nietzsche hug over the brooding character of a book. Is that what it is? Some think so. I don't. I think Ecclesiastes swims in a different stream than this tradition of reading. Ecclesiastes gives us dark clouds, despairing ones, but these clouds of reality are set against a backdrop that celebrates the goodness of God, His creation, and the freedom found in the fear of the Lord. Far from handcuffing its readers to the inevitability of despair, Ecclesiastes speaks with the wisdom of an elder. It guides readers through the stormy seas of life and points to safe harbors along the way. Readers of all times do well to engage Ecclesiastes and to engage it often. This is what Thomas Wolfe, early 20th century American writer, said about Ecclesiastes. Of all I have ever seen or learned, that book seemed to me the noblest, the wisest, the most powerful expression of man's life upon this earth, and also the highest flower of poetry, eloquence, and truth. I am not given, Wolfe says, to dogmatic judgments in the matter of literary creation. But if I had to make one, I could say that Ecclesiastes is the greatest single piece of writing I have ever known, and the wisdom expressed in it the most profound and the most lasting. So with that said, and I've been talking a little bit, do you care if I ask one of you to do some reading? Anybody have a Bible and willing to read out loud in front of the crowd? You didn't know I was going to do that. Yes, sir. Thank you. Would you do me a favor and read Ecclesiastes 1 through 11? Because we just have, these verses set the tone of the whole book. Thank you. What's your name?
Micah.
All right. Oh, Micah.
You said 1 through 11?
Yes, sir. Do you have any other minor prophet brothers or sisters? Any Jonah in the house?
Josiah.
Josiah. Wow. Okay.
A reading from the book of Ecclesiastes, beginning in chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south, and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness, a man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after.
Okay, thank you. Part of the challenge of the book of Ecclesiastes and interpreting it is dealing with how to interpret and translate a Hebrew word. I mean, and I hate to even say that. And I know I've got the Hebrew professor here in the room. I hate to say that because it sounds a little. And I encourage my students to be regularly. Like, don't go into the pulpit and use your knowledge of Hebrew as a kind of will to power move. You keep that in your study. Yet this book is open to a range of interpretations because of that famous phrase, vanity of vanities. That's a particular construction that Hebrew can use where it will put a singular noun and then jam it by a plural noun to raise the stakes. So, for example, the book of Song of Solomon in Hebrew is the Sir Hasarim, which is singular song next to plural songs. Song of songs, plural. What's the idea? Elevated songs. Really important songs. Something special going on here. To put it in our parlance, we'd say times 10 to the 10th power, right? So the Kohelet is drawing people together, and out of the gate, he's laying the foundation for the whole book. And if we don't get chapter 1 right, and I'm careful how I say that, because again, it's open to multiple readings here, but if we don't get it right, or how we go about reading chapter 1, we'll set the tenor for the whole book. Right. And here's the challenge, right? The challenge is Vanity of Vanities is a translation of a metaphor. Who's got the NIV? And I like the NIV. The New Inaccurate Version's fine. I'm joking. I like it. It's I don't mean that. But does anybody have the NIV in here? Okay. What is it? I know what it says. I don't like this, but go ahead and read it.
Meaningless.
Meaninglessness of meaninglessness. All is meaningless. I mean, that's laying a claim right here from an interpretive standpoint. One commentator uses the term absurdity, a guy named Michael Fox. Absurdity of absurdities. Vanity of Vanities, of course, is the English translation that goes back to the King James Version. That's got a long and noble history to it. Here's the challenge. The challenge is, the term is Hevel. Hebel. I tease my students at Beeson that if they're looking for a Hebrew tattoo, this wouldn't be a bad one. All the young people are getting tattoos these days. And I'll find my students, and if they have any Greek on their body, because they all like to do some New Testament Greek, I'm like, you better find a place in your body for Hebrew as well to balance the canon out on your body. Anyway, the term is Hevel. And if you were to look up in a lexicon, a dictionary, what Hevel means, you would find entries like this. Wind, breath, smoke. I was lecturing down at a seminary in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, now about 10 years ago, and I was lecturing in the lectern. It's an evangelical seminary, and I looked underneath the lectern, and there was, I kid you not, an ashtray with a cigar butt in it. and I thought, well, this is an interesting thing to see. So I queried about this, and they said, well, last week, pretty big name Old Testament scholar had been lecturing on the wisdom literature, a man named Bruce Waltke. So he had been here, he was lecturing, and he got to Ecclesiastes, and I said, well, tell me about the cigar. They said, well, when he got to Ecclesiastes, and they got to Hevel, he, unbeknownst to the students, yanked out a cigar from his pocket, clipped the end, lit it, started to draw on it, blew the smoke out, and said, Hevel. Right? There it is. That's Hevel. This is great. And this is part of the challenge. Metaphors betray simple translations. I'm not taking away our English Bibles from us. I love our translations. Thank God for them. But it's hard to translate metaphors into one option. I mean, what is a metaphor? A metaphor is explaining one thing by something else that's not like it. And by the way, this is a whole field of study right now that scholars are all excited about for the last 20 years. They call it cognitive linguistics. In other words, we, rather than something like Aristotle that would say metaphors are just ornamental things that you use in language that need to be avoided, more modern sort of linguistic theory says, hold on now, metaphors are not just ornamental, metaphors are the means by which we make sense of the world. Like we're not even conscious of it, you don't make sense of the world apart from making metaphoric associations all the time. The Bible does it all over the place. God is a rock. Well, I mean, we know he's not a rock, but what is it about rockness that helps us understand something about the reality of who God is and is relating to his people? Jesus is a lion. What does that mean? So Hevel here is a metaphor. Breath, smoke, wind, that's being used to describe your life, and what it means to be a human. Translations have to make a choice. The NIV's gone with meaningless. Others go with absurdity. Vanity is a kind of complicated one given the history of that word in the English language, but vanity's got a long and noble history. But can we just step back and maybe just feel the metaphor together? Like when you think of smoke or breath describing your existence and life under the sun, what does that make you think of? For me, it makes me think of two things. And I would love for you to press for more. But here's two things. Number one, I think the Hevel metaphor speaks to the fleeting character of our existence. It's number one. This is hard. The writings are tyrannical in forcing its readers to come to terms with its mortality again and again. Psalm 103, bless the Lord, O my soul, all that is within me, bless his holy name. Okay, yes, he's forgiven my sins, yes. Boy, what's the middle of Psalm 103? You're just dust. You're like the grass of the field that comes up one morning and it's been cut down the next morning. You're the shadow of the morning cast against the evening shade. You're here in the morning, you're gone at evening. Life is fleeting. We do all kinds of things to inoculate ourselves from that reality, but we know we can't escape its truth. Life is fleeting. When John was bringing me here today, I was conscious of the cemeteries that we passed along the way. Little reminders to us, even in downtown Columbia, that life is fleeting. We're here, and then we're gone. And here's the hard thing. You saw this maybe in the funeral of Queen Elizabeth when they read some of Psalm 103. And the place remembers its name no more. That is, our finitude is intended to humble us. In fact, if you hear Ecclesiastes 1 that was read so beautifully by Micah, if you hear that, our finitude is cast over against the stability of the created world. I mean, there are a lot of trees in Columbia, South Carolina that will outlive you by hundreds of years. That's kind of the idea in Ecclesiastes 1. Trees will be here a lot longer than you will. The mountains of the upstate are going to be here for generations beyond you. Creation has this stability. The rivers continue to run, but you're like the grass of the field that's here and then it's gone. And that's a dark cloud. That's a hard thing to come to terms with. Every human being has to come to terms with this in one way or another, but we are finite, and our finitude is cast over against the shadow of God's infinity. That's what we're living in, that tension. So number one, our lives are fleeting. It's smoke. But number two, and this is the one that's really sat with me. We get number one. We all know. We may not like it, but we all know it. Our bodies are falling apart. And they're not getting better. But number two, I also think about Hevel in terms of life's ungraspability. Let me try to explain this a little bit. And I'm talking here about the good things that we experience in life. Solomon's going to as well. We'll press into it. What do I mean by its ungraspability? That even the good things that we have in this life, the good moments, they're fleeting, we know that. And number two, we can't really press into the depth of what they offer. They always seem to intimate to us there's something more. There's got to be something more. Arthur Schopenhauer, 19th century philosopher, we just got a dog, and it's an English Springer Spaniel, so we had to give it an English name. But if I had a German short-haired pointer, I think Arthur Schopenhauer is a good dog name. Schopenhauer was a dour figure. He raised the question that philosophers have always been raising: is life worth living? He was the precursor to Nietzsche. In fact, Nietzsche would say that Schopenhauer was his great teacher. And Schopenhauer raises the question, is life worth living? And his answer is no. Right? Aristotle, Plato, they raised that question too. And the answer is yes, but it's only worth living if life is lived well. Let me show you what that looks like. Schopenhauer's like, no, life is not worth living. because life is suffering, and you can't transcend it. And it's all centered for Schopenhauer around the will. What does he mean by this? And there's something to this. Absent the reality of God and his purposes in the world, Schopenhauer is on to something. He said, here's his point about our suffering and our will. We are creatures that are made to desire and want things. He's read his St. Augustine. That's right. We are made hungry. We want things. And there's a suffering that we experience when we don't have what we want. But then he comes from the back end and he says, and here's the flip side though. We also know that once you get what it is that you want, boredom begins to settle in. Because you recognize that what you really wanted can't offer you what it seemed to suggest it would give you once you had it. And as a human being, you can never transcend that vortex of desire and boredom. We'll call this December 26th phenomenon for children. Right? All the anticipation, Christmas Day comes, then it's the next day, and it's like, was that all it is? That's the challenge. So when I talk about the ungraspability of life, what I mean is we recognize that life is moving and it's fleeting, and we can't even press into the good moments in the ways in which we really want to. I think about this in relationship to my father, who's 82, facing his mortality. I want more for my relationship with my father. And I've got a good one. I love my dad. And I want more. I sit with him, we talk, and we laugh. And yet I know, like, there's got to be more here. I'm yearning. Why? Because these finite things whisper to us about something even more that we're hungry for. So when I talk about ungraspability, what I mean is even the best things in life are hard to settle on because they're fleeting and they're ungraspable. We can't press all the meaning. We can't extract all the significance out of the good things that we experience even in this life. That's Hevel. For Schopenhauer and for Nietzsche, for that particular tradition, they understood that there were two places in life where you can actually transcend that. And it was for them the experience of music primarily. Like when you experience a music concert, you can experience the transcendent, and your human suffering can be suspended for a moment. But here's the Hevel character of that, even for them. But the concert comes to an end. It collapses on itself. So that moment of time opens up, and then it collapses on itself, and then you move on. And the author of Ecclesiastes is saying that's Hevelim. He presses into three areas, and then we'll take our break. He presses into three areas where he shows us in particular where this is the case. Number one, he shows us that our search for wisdom. Number two, the toil of our hands and the pleasures of this life are Hevelim. They're ungraspable. They're fleeting. Kohelet describes his situation in terms of his studious efforts to gain wisdom and knowledge. He describes devoting all of his rational faculties to understand the world, to categorize the world, to differentiate all the varieties of matter and motion under the sun, and to gain expertise in the practical art of living well. Yet even for this, he recognizes the limitations of this pursuit. If the wisdom of the world flows from the mind and the intent of its creator, then human beings will always face the limitations of their knowledge. Right when we think we have something in our hands, it becomes wind that moves through our fingers. Ecclesiastes 1:18, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. He also says that our pleasures are Hevel. They're fleeting. He gave himself in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, to laughter, to wine, to possessions, and to entertainment. And I want to say, I don't think Kohelet is describing, spring break of his junior year of college. And I don't think he's listing here what we would call hedonistic pleasures. I think he's talking about the good things of this life. Joy, good bottle of wine, possessions, entertainment, even wealth. Nothing inherently evil And yet even this portion of life that we're given can leave us empty and unsatisfied. Even the good things of this world can witness to Hevel. Listen to what he says in Ecclesiastes 2:2. Laughter becomes madness to me. And the third thing he says is that the work of his hands can become breath or smoke. Why would he describe his work as grievous and Hevel? Why? Because his labors are set against the backdrop of his finitude, and they lose their luster and their promise. All this building and making something out of nothing, all of this industry will outlast me. And once I'm gone, who's going to oversee all the things that I've given my life to? There's no guarantee, the preacher laments, that the person who takes over the toil of my hands will be a wise man. He might be a fool and squander it all away. And he says, that leaves me grievous in life under the sun. Who doesn't sympathize with Kohelet over these realities? Scholars, I think about this in my world, might give their whole career to a particular branch of knowledge, write some summative piece of work in their field. And then you know what they do? They place their research in some solitary place among the hosts of all the other books in the library. One book, fill in that slot right there, waiting to be countered in the future by another scholar. These are heavy thoughts. Fiction, by the way, is filled with lamentable figures like this. Think about Mr. Casaubon in Middlemarch, William Stoner in the novel Stoner. I was reading, I've been listening to Wallace Stegner's Crossing to Safety again. I was on audio on the way here from Birmingham, describing the life of two young English professors at the University of Wisconsin, and the father-in-law spending all summer and all of his time researching on some sort of esoteric group of Byzantine scholars. You know, come and they go. So there's no guarantee that in this world of our life under the sun that we can escape Hevel Hevelim. We can't escape our finitude. We can't escape the ungraspability of even the good things of our lives, our toil, our pleasure, the pursuit of wisdom. And that leaves us in a place that we're open to something else filling in those voids, or at least framing how we understand the Hevel Hevelim character of our existence. We can't transcend it. We can't escape it. And yet, there's a silver lining. So we'll take a little break. That was heavy. I can sense the heaviness in the room. I'm sorry. But we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll see what wisdom the preacher has to offer us in light of the reality of our human lives.